British didn't take Australia, other people would. And after 1776, there was a general move of the emphasis in the British Empire from the Americas to Asia. And this, there are a number of ways this is expressed, and they're all happening at exactly the same time as the decision was taken to establish New South Wales. 1783, there was the acquisition of the island of Penang in modern Malaysia, promptly renamed Prince of Wales Island. So there's Penang, which is the first British permanent possession in Southeast Asia in 1783. From 1790, there's a much bigger British presence in Canton. And we're getting the beginnings of that, of British power on the South China coast, which culminate in the seizure of Hong Kong 50 years later. So the decision to colonise New South Wales, which was taken in 1786, is in this context: protecting the sea routes to China, making sure the Dutch or the French didn't annex it. Cook's report, of course, said that it was a good place to settle. A claim had been made, but if a claim isn't exercised, it lapses. So the decisions were diverse. There was also the possibility that there could be useful maritime goods there, things like flax and the Norfolk Island pine. Well, the flax and the Norfolk Island pine proved to be bitter disappointments for making sails and ships' masts, but they were probably minor motives. The two major motives were getting rid of the convicts and ensuring that British power had a base in Asia. And indeed, that's how it worked out. The one time there has been war in a general war in the Western Pacific, which is 1941 to 1945, Australia was the great base from which Western interests were defended. So it worked out exactly as anticipated. The enemy wasn't one they could have guessed in 1786, but the general scenario was one they guessed in 1786. Now, what were the aims of this? Well, they were dual, as with all penal systems, both to punish and to reform. Right? Now, for most of the convicts, this was seen as a terrible punishment, going out to New South Wales. But there was also the aim of reform, and most of the governors of New South Wales, including the first and the fifth, most importantly, Governors Phillip and Macquarie, placed a great deal of emphasis on reform. They saw the opportunities to create a new society. Phillip was an agnostic and a man of the Enlightenment. Macquarie is a Scot and rather more religious. But although religious, he was a Protestant. He wasn't really strong on original sin. And both of these governors believed that the system of transportation, sending convicts to Australia, could be a great way to reform them and create a useful society. Now, of course, when we look at the great debate, the nature-nurture debate, what makes human beings as they are? Do they behave badly because they are inherently wicked and it's in their genes, or is it because of unfortunate circumstances? That great debate. To my mind, that great debate is settled in the history of Australia. After all, Australia is a society that has been created from criminals. And yet it is not a society in which criminality is notably greater than anywhere else in the world. Quite the reverse, in fact. We tend to have fairly low rates of criminality, despite our descent from convicts. And I say our quite deliberately, because I am myself a descendant of a first fleeter and a convict. So I'll tell you his story, which is a rather typical one. His name was John Nichols. He came from London. He worked in a haberdashery shop, a shop which sold cloth and thread and buttons and knitting needles and all that sort of thing. He was jealous of his boss's wealth. So he decided to appropriate some of it, to liberate it. He, though, stole more than a handkerchief. In fact, one weekend he managed to hire a cart, open the shop on a Sunday, and load its entire contents, its entire stock and trade into a cart and went off to Chester, then still an important and big city. I mean, Manchester's on the way to growing up, but Chester was kind of the big city of the northwest then. Went off to Chester and opened a shop with the stolen goods. He was found out. Now, he was very lucky to escape being hanged. He wasn't hanged. He was sentenced to 14 years transportation to New South Wales, came out on the First Fleet, and was a model convict. Obviously, he is a man of entrepreneurial spirit. His motives were very much to become wealthier, and so by the time of Lachlan Macquarie, he's got a land grant at Seven Hills. Becomes a magistrate, a landowner. Unfortunately, he's impoverished. He never goes from being a modest landowner to a rich landowner because he has so many children and so many wives. He keeps marrying young girls in their mid-teens, and then they all seem to die in childbirth, and then another one comes along. So he's a bit of a dirty old man, but he certainly made the leap into respectability as a result of that. And he is quite typical of many convicts. Most convicts during the term of their sentences worked for private settlers, except in the very first few years. They worked for private settlers, and in working for private settlers, the settlers were obliged to provide them with food according to specific government instructions. And the food that they were provided was actually very generous. Their diet was far better than they would have been used to in England. And this, of course, led to the phenomenon of the first generations of Australians born in the period 1790 to 1830, surprising everyone by, instead of being weedy criminal types, being tall, well-spoken in a kind of larrikiny sort of way, and already developing the Australian accent. So this surprised that the offspring of these convicts actually seemed to be quite impressive, which was not at all what was expected. So that's an example of the triumph of the of nurture over nature. Not all of them were criminals. There were also the men guarding them, the soldiers of the New South Wales Corps. Now, the officers of the New South Wales Corps were mostly junior officers who weren't too ambitious. This is, after all, the time of the Napoleonic Wars. If you were an ambitious military officer, you would rather be fighting the French than coming to New South Wales and guarding convicts. If you were a brave officer, you would rather be fighting the French than guarding convicts in New South Wales. But if you were a greedy officer, you could see the opportunity of lots of land you could grab guarding convicts in New South Wales, and the possibility of lots of labour you could have. And so the officers who came to New South Wales tended to be very greedy. And the classic example, of course, is John MacArthur, the founder of the Australian wool industry. He was an officer of the New South Wales Corps who made his fortune by grabbing land, mostly out near Camden, and importing sheep. As for the soldiers who were guarding the men, who didn't really need much guarding because running away wasn't really an option, as for the soldiers who were allegedly guarding the men, well, I think it's best to quote the judgment of the Duke of Wellington, Britain's senior soldier of the time. This was his judgment of his soldiers. The very scum of the earth. Some of our men enlist from having got bastard children, some for minor offences, many more for drink. Right, so that was the judgment of the Duke of Wellington of his soldiers. So the soldiers really weren't much better than the convicts. At the end of the soldiers' enlistment and at the end of the convict sentences, land grants were normal. And these land grants, if generally what happened, if the person proved to be a success, they get more land grants. So that, of course, creates the first or the origins of Australian wealth. Wealth at first in Australia was more from the sea than the land, particularly from whaling, when whales used to breed in all the bays along the New South Wales coast and the coast of Tasmania. Whales were ready